Our scripture this morning is Matthew 17, 2 through 9. The words can be found on pages 17 through 18 in the New Testament of the Pew Bible, which is in the back, and will be displayed on the screens. Matthew 17, 2 through 9, New Revised Standard Version. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with them. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings. Here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them. And from the cloud a voice said, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." May the church hear what the Spirit is trying to tell us.
Sometimes in lectionary readings that we have to, the lectionary skips over some stuff. There's really a critical verse that leads into this. And it's the first verse of Matthew 17, which says, 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, his brother John, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. And then it leads into what Lee so graciously read for us. So today is Transfiguration Sunday in the life of the church, and it marks the end of the season of Epiphany, where Epiphany is that where God is made known to the world. That's what Epiphany means, made known. Ash Wednesday is coming up, the beginning of Lent. So Transfiguration Sunday kind of bridges these two times together, that Epiphany has been full of light. The light of Christ has come into the world. And then now Lent will be coming. And we're going to experience the darkness of the crucifixion. But that's later. But it's important, these words 6 days later, because if you go in the previous chapter of Matthew, you'll discover what happened 6 days before, because it's really crucial to understanding this text. And it was 6 days earlier that Jesus and his disciples were traveling through, and Jesus decides to ask the question, "Who do the people say that I am?" And he got various answers, right? You remember the story. Some of them were saying, well, some believe that you're one of the prophets of old. Some believe that you may be John the Baptist resurrected. And no doubt they probably had other ideas as well that didn't get recorded. But Jesus says to them, he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And then who's the one that likes to really get out front and blurt out before he thinks? It's Peter. It's Peter. He says, "You are the Son of God." Hooray for Peter. And then Jesus begins to tell him, because he said the Messiah as well, but Jesus begins to say, what does it mean to be Messiah for Jesus? Because Peter's expectation and Jesus' expectation were not on the same wavelength. Because when Jesus says that he must suffer and die, Peter says, wait a minute, God forbid that ever happened to you, Jesus. And then Jesus looks at him, and what does he say? "Get behind me, Satan." So it seems right then and there that the mind of Peter is not set with the mind of Jesus. It's very interesting as well that the underlying Greek word for "get behind" is the same word that Jesus uses to follow me, to follow me. So Jesus is in a sense saying, Peter, you have gotten way too far ahead. You need to get behind me so you can start following again. So that's what happened 6 days later. So 6 days of traveling to get to this particular mountain, I can only wonder what's going in the minds of those disciples. This interaction between Jesus and Peter, they're thinking about Jesus' question about who I am. And so Jesus Maybe he holds a lot. Draw straws. Who's going to come up with me on the mountain? All right? And maybe he just kind of pushes one up so Peter gets that one. Because it was important for Peter to experience what he was about to experience. So they get up on this mountain, and lo and behold, the transfiguration happens. The transfiguration happens. Fred Craddock, he's a preacher, a United Methodist preacher and teacher of homiletics as well. He talks in the Gospel of Matthew. He says that the Magi, when they're coming to see Jesus, that's the one epiphany event. He says there's other ones that happen, or what he calls Christophanies, an emphasis on Christ being made known. The first one being the Magi, because that's the whole world knowing that this is Jesus, and he's a special kind of guy. The second one that Craddock talks about is the notion when, remember, there's a storm and Jesus is out there walking on the water and invites Peter to come and walk with him. Remember that? And Peter just has his eyes because, again, Peter, he likes to get out there first and doing everything. And as soon as he steps off the boat, he takes his eyes off of Jesus because the water's there. And what does he do? Splash! And then this transfiguration is the third Christophany. Fanny, I guess, maybe to emphasize that. Where Christ is made known in a special way again. Again. Let me share some other words from Craddock. He says another one too is that when he meets his Galilee, the disciples in Galilee, when they come to him after the resurrection. And if you remember there in the Gospel of Matthew, some of them worship him and some of them doubt. But Craddock, he says this, even so, looking at the transfiguration in conjunction with other Christophanies reminds us that such texts speak uniquely of Jesus Christ in ways that evoke from the church awe, fear, and worship. I mean, think about what we heard in the scriptures. There was awe, and then there was fear. And then there was the desire to worship. Remember, Peter wants to make a church. When we understand that, we will be more hesitant about squeezing some relevant exhortation from the story. That is, preachers should watch what they say about this. Drawing hasty comparisons to current events or finding analogies within our own experiences. While interpretation, and he means biblical interpretation, should bridge the distance between the biblical text and ourselves, it should not simply collapse that distance, drawing parallels that are not parallel, thereby reducing and even trivializing such a grand text. I mean, certainly we all have mountaintop experiences, right? And they're glorious, but how many of us have ever heard the voice of God say, listen to him? Okay, just wanted to check. And so, as he says, after trivializing the grand text, this warning is most appropriate for all the Christological texts. So to be sure, he says, the Word became flesh, identified with us, was tempted in every way as we are, knew the common human condition of suffering and death, and in that identification provided us with not only example, but an intercessor. Jesus now is the intercessor who understands our infirmities. But not all Christology fits the contours of our lives. Not all Christology can be consumed without remainder in moral example and ethical preachments. I love the words that he uses. But while Christ is as we are and therefore will help, Matthew's Christophanies remind us that we are not as we are, and therefore Jesus can help us in our times of need. So I came across this term called sharenting. Have any of you heard this term before? It's been around for a couple of years now, but I was reading it in my work on getting the sermon ready, but I was really surprised to find it on my CNN app on my iPhone. Sharenting. It sounds like parenting, right? Sharenting is when a parent takes lots of pictures of their children or videos and posts it everywhere on social media. It's sharing the kids, whether the kids like it or not. So Bob Kaler has something to say about this that I thought would be very interesting. He said, but recently a different problem with sharenting has been pointed out. Sharenting completely overrides whatever privacy rights the child may have. So those beautiful things you see of children, babies or little pictures, those children did not give permission for their parents to take their picture. In extreme forms, parental sharing of their children's information has led to a phenomenon known as digital kidnapping, whereby children's photos and details have been appropriated by others who promote the kids as being their own. Also, some of these innocent photographs have turned up on pedophilic websites, and sometimes all altered in revolting ways. And some of the info has also been used by predators to target children once they get on the web themselves. So it's not all good, this thing happening. But even assuming nothing nasty comes of it, he continues, that this information has a way of lingering online, even if parents eventually take it down. This may be especially true when a parent is blogging about the difficulty of parenting a child with discipline or self-control issues. And some of this has been reshared, and search engines such as Google Index can cache the information, providing an opportunity for the rediscovery long after the issue has led to some disclosure has been resolved. So you may or may not know, but stuff on the internet lives forever. Even if you wipe it out on your own, it's still there somewhere and people can find it. So beware what you post. Beware what you post. Because as he continues, he says, for some children, this becomes a problem, something they must overcome as older. There is no opt-out for link for children. They are not yet of the age to understand enough about life to exercise such an option as if there were one. But offspring might one day resent the disclosures made years earlier by their parents. So that's something to think about, the sharenting aspect of that the children have no choice, that their images are being displayed all around the internet. Remember the good old days when there was the photo album and you would invite your friends to sit over? Maybe that's what we need to get back to. But I mention sharenting because if we think of God as the father of Jesus, a very proud parent is now sharing. Sharing with Peter, James, and John. This moment, this extraordinary moment with his son Jesus. And so Jesus begins to glow, transfigured. The underlying word in Greek, he was metamorphized. I think that's the word. He changed. His appearance changed. And this was very significant for what was happening. Additionally, there are two other figures that show up as well. Moses and Elijah. And of course, when we think about earlier that Matthew has talked about wanting to show that Jesus is one who is greater than Moses and one who is greater than Elijah. If we really think about it, the Gospel of Matthew is one big confession about who Jesus is. Who Jesus is. Now, there's also a couple of things about Moses and Elijah, and is that they were both great prophets, even though we understand Moses as a lawgiver as well, but he was also a prophet. And both of them did miracles in their lives. So this, again, is another way of confessing about Jesus as being someone who is a little bit better than what the Jews had expected in their time. Because the Jewish people in the time of Jesus were expecting somebody like a Moses and even Elijah to physically come back and lead them to the Messiah. That was their belief. But with Moses, they also had interesting deaths. And they also had hard times. Moses had to deal with the stiff-necked people, right? And Elijah had to deal with Ahab and Jezebel. In Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 5 and 6, then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. He was buried in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows his burial place to this day. So later traditions would hold that, that it was God who buried Moses. And because of that happening, that maybe Moses didn't die the same way that you and I will die. That perhaps there was something special about this. And those traditions certainly carried all the way forth to the time of Jesus. So that's why it's also special that Moses is there. And then we get to Elijah. Well, first of all, I should say this too. As Eric Barreto writes, he says, the very last verses of Deuteronomy that lauds Moses as an unparalleled prophet up to his time, a liberator of his own people through the Lord. Thus, when Moses appears on the Mount of Transfiguration, he embodies the heights and possibilities of the Israelite prophetic tradition. For Matthew, Moses' presence affirmed the many ways that the Gospel of Matthew has sought to align Jesus and Moses. And Elijah's death has much in common with Moses. From chapter 2, verse 11 and 12 of 2 Kings, as they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. And Elijah ascended in a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha kept watching and crying out, Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. But when he could no longer see him, he grasped his own clothes and tore them into pieces. And again, Barreto says, this dramatic, powerful scene feeds a prophetic hope of Elijah's return, since he did not die in a typical way. So what's happening here is that both Elijah and Moses are putting their stamp of approval, so to speak, on Jesus' call. And remember, Jesus' call 6 days earlier was to identify that he is one who has to suffer. That's his theology of what it means to be a Messiah. That his suffering will take him to the place of a cross. So, we have all this stuff happening. It's awesome, it's fearful, it's glorious. And who decides to speak up again? It's Peter. And what does he want to do? He wants to build First Church Jesus right there on the mountain. We can have people come up here. We don't have to go to Jerusalem anymore. It's here, it's where it's at. And then, that's when the cloud comes, because I could see God is seeing things are getting a little out of hand here. And so he says, remember what he said at Jesus' baptism, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. And he confirms that once again. And then he adds these words, listen to him. Very important. I can only imagine what's going on in Peter's mind, aside this trying to figure out what to say and what to do here. But maybe something is beginning to penetrate. If Jesus says that my Messiahship is to be this way, then you need to listen to him about that. And if it takes him to Jerusalem up on a cross, it might take you up there too. Because if you remember, after Jesus talks about this, he says something about everyone must take up their cross too. Whatever it is that you feel passionate about, that you're willing to die for, that's your cross. And so, there they go. The voice, the cloud lifts, and all of a sudden it's just Jesus, James and John. And they have to go down the mountain. Well, how do you go down a mountain and try to figure out what happened? You know, what are you going to tell those other guys that they missed? And what does Jesus say? Shh. You don't get it really yet, but you will. But you can share this story after. And certainly it must have been shared after, because we get the story in our gospel today. So friends, this transfiguration of Jesus means a transformation of Jesus. And what those disciples are watching, because again of the suspicious deaths that are not normal of Moses and Elijah and Jesus glowing, what those disciples are getting a glimpse of what it means to be in resurrected form. Resurrected form. And that's what's awesome as well. Awesome as well. So they have to get down the mountain. They do go down the mountain. The story gets told. It does come in the scriptures. But friends, how do we proclaim our transformation? As I said to the children, how do we glow? How can we glow for people? I'll just share a couple of tidbits that I had written down here. Oops. We can proclaim transformation for our lives because our future looks bright because we have a God who loves us with such passion that God gives us his own son, Jesus, that we might experience that passionate love. We can proclaim transformation for our lives because our future looks bright because through Jesus we get to see, like Peter and the others, what our resurrected nature will look like. And we can proclaim transformation for our lives because our future looks bright because we are invited to listen. Listen to Jesus and experience the best of what life has to offer through our relationship with Jesus, a life that brings daily hope, a life that brings us into loving relationships, a life that can find strength in the midst of pain and death, a life that is transformative. So friends, if we can be transformed ourselves and we can glow with smiles and a happy face, and we're out there in the mission field, maybe that's how we can attract, like fireflies to a light, people to know Jesus, like the way we know Jesus. Amen.